Okay, thank you, Janice, and thank you to the Vermont Family Network for inviting us to do this webinar. My name is Kasey McManmon, and it is a pleasure to be here. Kelli Borgman and I are both dietitians for the Vermont Department of Health Children with Special Health Needs Nutrition Program, and this is our first webinar called Healthy Feeding Foundations. So I'm going to start off by talking about some strategies to prevent picky eating from an early age. And I'll provide some strategies to help increase the dietary variety for parents and providers that are caring for children with narrow food preferences. And I'm going to focus my discussion on feeding children from about birth to 2 years old. I'm not really going to talk about the importance of good nutrition. That's an entire different webinar on its own. Kind of as a disclaimer, I'm taking a pretty non-medicalized focus here, a more practical approach from my experience as a dietitian for children with special health needs for 7 years, but more importantly, as a mother of 4. Some of my talk is probably just up for discussion and simply my own opinions and strategies that I've found to be successful. And it's focused on prevention, which means in an ideal, perfect world, this is how I would encourage you to feed your child, your typically developing child, or the children in your life. And I know that life is anything but perfect. Working with the children with special health needs population, I'm very familiar with the barriers that are out there, time and money being 2 of the biggest culprits. So if your child doesn't absolutely love eating large servings of vegetables, please don't blame yourself and find fault in your own caregiving. If there's anything I've learned from being a mother, it's that judging yourself or judging other mothers or other parents and caregivers, we're all in it together. It's not helpful to do that, and we're all doing the best that we can. So my first rule is that eating is enjoyable. Who loves to eat? It's one of the most enjoyable parts of life. Eating together as family and friends, and whether it's a celebration or just daily life. And when it's nutritious and delicious, it's a win-win. In infancy, nourishment is comfort. It's dependability. It's affection and love and trust. Babies are learning to interact and they're learning to communicate. They're forming these psychosocial developmental tasks. And when a woman is breastfeeding, she's producing the same hormones that she feels when she feels intense love. So any disruption in this feeding relationship can lead to an eating disorder later on in life. Inattention to a child's hunger and satiety cues as an infant has been associated with overfeeding later in life. But I'm going to skip through bottle feeding and breastfeeding and move on to the introduction of solids and talk about food. Oops. Sorry. I hit the wrong button. Maybe this will work now. All right, thank you. So ideally, the introduction of solids happens in about 4 to 6 months. 6 months is recommended if a child is breastfed. And I want to mention some new research that's out there while I'm talking about introduction of solids. The Consumer Products Safety Commission came out with a recent report about the amount of arsenic in rice products. It turns out that the rice plant is very good at pulling out arsenic from the soil, which is usually there due to pesticides. And we know that arsenic increases the risk of cancer, so babies who get 2 servings of rice cereal a day could double their cancer risk over a lifetime. So it's not worth the risk, and I would encourage people to introduce oatmeal cereal or an organic rice cereal from a trusted brand is okay. And peanuts, there was an very interesting study recently done with following Israeli children for about 5 years that showed that giving peanut products early in life actually prevents peanut allergies. So we have had it entirely backwards. There's no reason to delay the introduction of peanut product whatsoever unless there is a peanut allergy in the family history or if the child is at a higher risk of having a food allergy, like having bad eczema or other allergic symptoms, then parents should talk to a doctor before introducing peanuts. And then also fish, we know, has very important nutrients. And there's a study from Sweden that showed that children who ate fish during infancy cut their risk of allergies by about 25%. And that was with 2 meals of fish a month. So this research, it kind of reinforces my takeaway point, which is that offering a wide variety of foods early on is the goal. There's something labeled now baby-led weaning. It actually is pretty much how I fed my older children when I was a younger mother. Here's a quote from babyledweaning.com. You just hand them the food in a suitably sized piece, and if they like it, they eat it, and if they don't, they won't. That's the essence of baby-led weaning. No purees, no ice cube trays, no food processor, no potato masher, no weird fruit and veggie combos, just you and your child eating foods that you enjoy with your family. It puts the baby in charge of how much he or she eats. And a study from New Zealand found that this kind of feeding decreases the risk of obesity. So when you're first introducing food, you want to make sure that you're introducing one food every 2 to 3 days so that if there is a possible allergic reaction, it can be pinpointed. But then as the child tolerates, a handful of new foods and everything is going well, then I would encourage you to really introduce a wide range of tastes and flavors in that 6 to 12 month age period. The early infants are offered food with a specific strong taste, such as vegetables, the more likely they are to accept that food. And they're also more likely to accept new foods and new tastes if they're given earlier in the period of introduction of solids. So I would re-examine what we think of as baby food and the kids' food menu, kind of expand our own expectations of what children will eat and should eat. And then as a child starts eating more foods regularly, it's important to examine the balance between drinking calories and eating calories. Please don't try feeding a child any type of healthy food or new food just after they've had a large volume of something to drink, especially something with calories in it, like milk or juice or other flavored beverages. They're just not going to be that hungry. And then with a low appetite, it's a physiological process. Foods just don't taste as good. And only foods that are really high in salt or sugar can override that lack of tastiness. And so that's how bad eating habits can start developing. The best time to introduce a food or, in some meals is when a child is hungry. So I call the period between 6 months and 2 years old the dance of feeding the toddler. It definitely takes some grace and balance. There's the self-feeding that I was talking about, the baby-led weaning, but then also feeding your child and continuing that relationship where you're feeding the child and they're feeding themselves, sometimes at the same exact time. I think it's important to have a mixed approach, and that one of the biggest mistakes we can make as a culture is to encourage children to exclusively self-feed at an early age. A child becoming more independent is a wonderful thing, but when they are in exclusive control over their intake, then those behavioral patterns can lead to nutritional gaps sometimes. They may not choose to feed themselves the healthy foods that are on their plate. So I would use a spoon or fork, fingers, and make little perfect bites. Maybe you mix a few specks of broccoli into some squash. My 20-month-old now, I think when he was around about a year old, he made a terrible face when I gave him some broccoli. And so instead of just not giving him broccoli again or forcing him to eat the broccoli even though he didn't want it, I just put a little a few specks of broccoli into the squash that I was feeding him. And I think the next couple times he ate broccoli, I helped him have it be a little bit more palatable for him by mixing it with something else that he was eating, some cheese or carrots, and then gradually he was eating broccoli plain, and now he loves broccoli. He shoves it right in. So I wouldn't accept, and it's actually a kind of a pet peeve of mine to hear, my child doesn't like green beans, my child doesn't like this, when the baby is, 7 months old or something like that. It's really kind of up to the caregiver at that point to help that child develop that tolerance and those tastes. We've had a group when the baby is opening their mouths wide for a bite without even looking to see what it is. That's trust, and that's trust. It's something that they like. It's something that they can handle in their mouths. Something that's the right temperature. Something they've probably had before, and you're, as the caregiver, paying attention to the texture and removing any skins and making it palatable for them. And as they get older, you can incorporate more language into your food conversations, making it exciting to eat a new food and interesting. Look at the design of the inside of a sliced beet, or kiwi seeds are really cool. And then again, when a child is tired, pay attention to those cues and be attentive. If you're in a hurry, then be flexible, use the best means possible. Use your fingers. Maybe it's time to have something a little softer and easier for a child to manage in their mouths and not have to work on chewing, something like a smoothie. And of course, it's ideal for them to sit in a high chair for their meal times, but realistically at this age, they're eating so often and we're busy that sometimes snacks and meals are on the go. And I've been known to give my child a bath in the kitchen sink. And while I'm preparing dinner, I'm occasionally popping little bites of steamed vegetables into his mouth while he's playing, and he barely even notices. So I can get lots of nutritious food into him while he's playing. So a vital part of feeding and eating is the child's ability to regulate their own food intake. Please don't continue to feed a child when they are showing signs of being all done. You want to be attentive to those satiety cues. There's no appetite stimulant like hunger. It's definitely okay for a child to feel hunger. We need to remember that in this well-fed society. It's awesome when a child's hungry. Then it's time to take advantage and offer those healthier, sometimes less preferred foods, but definitely not when they're done. I'm going to let you read through these cues yourself. I'm sure we've all, as caregivers, seen most of these behaviors, throwing food, just being extra wiggly as a toddler. Feeding a child when they are exhibiting these cues can lead to more aversions. And, you want to make sure that eating is fun. That was then rule number 1. Rule number 2 is, and I only have 2 rules, so don't worry. Rule number 2 is that we are a child's role models as caregivers, and they imitate us. And so showing them that you can eat that food first helps them feel safe. And actually, with a food safety background, it's safer to eat the food first. I don't know how many of you have been in a situation when you've offered a child something a little rotten or spoiled or stale or spicy without knowing it. Poor child. A really good practice is to get in habit of, tasting the food yourself, and ideally eating those same foods together. Sitting and eating together. There's a lot of evidence out there that shared meal times help improve health and development and behavior of children as they grow. Children are naturally afraid of new foods. It's called neophobia. And children with neophobic parents are more likely to be neophobic themselves. So it's wonderful to be that role model and be brave and show children, oh, this is delicious. I love this, even if you're not genuinely feeling that way. And then opposite is true too. If you are eating junk food, I would keep it out of the house. I would keep it even just around the corner. And kids will get smarter as they get older, and they'll catch you eating the chocolate somewhere without them. But, setting that foundation in the beginning is really important, and keeping it out of the house as much as you can, because we all know it's unavoidable outside of the house. Junk food is everywhere. So if it's necessary, it would be helpful sometimes for an entire family to change their food culture and increase the nutrient density of their diets. Kids eat small portions, and it's a challenge to get all those essential vitamins and minerals into them without really paying attention to what nutrition you're giving them every day. Encouraging families to eat less packaged foods. It takes more time to prepare. So you have to kind of really be ready, like a stage of behavioral change is readiness to make the healthy eating a priority. And sometimes having a new child in the home can be a wonderful opportunity for behavioral change. It goes a long way to avoid picky eating and struggles around meal times for years. And it can be difficult for individuals since food is such a personal and emotional part of life, and it can be even more difficult when there are a lot of players involved in a large family. But it's really just never too late. My 70-year-old father is now adding avocado to his own smoothies to kind of acculturate his own diet and slowly let his body adapt to the intake of avocados, even though he hates them plain. It's kind of inspirational to see for a 70-year-old. Because kids grow up so fast, you hear it all the time, usually from older women or older men kind of gazing admirably at you with your child. My favorite quote I've heard lately is, the days are long, but the years are short. It's just time just goes by so quickly, and before you know it, maybe your baby has never been exposed to Brussels sprouts. It can happen. It can happen with anything. For my kids, it was an iron. They were around 8 or 10 and 12, and they saw me using an iron in the laundry room, and they were flabbergasted. They were like, "What is that thing?" But it can happen with something as simple as green beans. If you're not making a huge effort to buy every single vegetable that's offered in your grocery store and offer it to your child especially during those first 6 to 12 months, then your child may not be forming pathways in his or her brain telling him or her that this is an accepted food. And more importantly, what happens is if you offer an entire variety of vegetables and fruits that exist in your supermarket, then your child has become accustomed to eating a wide variety of foods on a regular basis, which is really the point. They might look at a new food and say, "What is this?" But you're feeding them when they're hungry, and they trust you that you're not going to give them something terrible. They're used to eating all different kinds of things pretty regularly, so they gobble it right up. And that's the pattern that's been practiced. So they have a new favorite food, Brussels sprouts. Who knew? The danger is that you get busy and you lose focus on prioritizing feeding your child vegetables every day and really regularly. Otherwise, habits develop quickly, and macaroni and cheese and peanut butter and jelly or packaged foods just take over as the expected foods in that child's diet, and then you have to go through a pattern of reintroducing foods rather than them being part of the foundation. So one of the strategies I use is steaming vegetables. It's really quite simple. You cut vegetables into small pieces. You put them into a steaming basket. You add some water and cover them up. And if you're like me doing 10 other things in the kitchen at the same time and you get distracted, maybe you should set a timer. And if you want to steam different vegetables. You can add the longer cooking veggies first and then some quicker cooking veggies after a few minutes. I use these probably every day now, and my little 20-month-old snacks on them. They're easy to transport. You keep them cool if you're going to be out all day. Put them in a little cooler bag or something. But there's no excuse for your child not to eat vegetables if you have them and they're around. And it really does only take about 10 minutes, maybe 15, depending on how distracted you get in the kitchen with your little one. And then another strategy is smoothies. And you will hear all about people's smoothie making process if you know people who drink smoothies, because I think people get a little smoothie crazy out there. I think it's fairly simple if you have a good blender. You can just choose a base. I usually use yogurt, and I add a little bit of nut butter most days, and they're all kind of different. But this is where the steamed vegetables can come into play again. Anything that's left over blends right up and can mix in with a little bit of frozen fruit. If you add a banana, your smoothie will be sweet, and it will taste delicious. If you don't love bananas, I've recently found that sweet potato works really well. It doesn't make your smoothie taste like sweet potato. It just kind of sweetens it up. And then just make sure it's a good consistency, and it's a nice, easy, really an efficient meal or snack for your little one. There's no chewing involved. If they're tired, it's quick. So I've found in my experience that there's something intuitive that happens when a child or an adult ingests certain foods, even when they're not fully tasting them, that it seems as though they kind of develop a taste for the foods just by having them being ingested regularly. Right, so it's never too late. And instead of hiding foods, I like to think about it as incorporating them. You just find ways to add healthier foods into those foods that you're eating every day. Like, for instance, I make scrambled eggs with whatever sauteed veggies or leftovers that are in the fridge, made usually with some cheese or some type of pesto, and that's just how they come on the plate to my kids. And they're used to it, and they gobble them up. Of course, it's not easy if this hasn't been the way that a child is presented their eggs. Then it would be kind of a shocker for them, for a picky kid to find some kale or leeks in their eggs. But you could get to that place gradually. For a child who only eats plain macaroni and cheese or plain pasta with butter, a possible first step is to introduce them to an herb garden and experience the herbs and smell them and get excited about all the different herbs and how the butterflies are attracted to them. And then maybe they want to sprinkle a tiny bit onto their macaroni and cheese. It's a slow introduction, but the child is allowing green stuff to be mixed into their foods. And as a child gets older, we're not talking about prevention as much anymore as treatment, and treating a child as an individual and helping them to expand their food choices. So there are a couple of resources here, some books that really get into incorporating, as I say, more healthy foods into those regular meals that we find in our home. And I am going to leave it to Kelli Borgman, RD extraordinaire, to take over from here.
Thanks, Kasey. All right. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning into our webinar on feeding foundations. I hope it gives both parents and providers some helpful tips and guidance, as well as sharing with you all some of the best research and resources out there when it comes to picky eating. So I'll be going over the toddler and preschool years. So let's get started, since there's a lot going on for our kids at this age, as we are very well aware. So I wanted to start out with a quote from the woman who is really the thought leader behind the current theories in parent-child feeding relationships and childhood feeding dynamics. Her name is Ellen Satter. I encourage you to pick up her book or go to her website. She's got some awesome resources. She's really been setting the standards in childhood nutrition for the last 40 or so years. And her work really continues to be borne out by the research done really worldwide in this area. So the quote is, "Parenting well with food demands that you find that gray area somewhere between the extremes of being neglectful and not trying to help at all, and being domineering and helping so much that it's harmful rather than helpful. It's very tricky business." I wonder if any of you can relate to this quote. Have you ever wondered where you and your family lies in this mysterious gray area Ellen speaks of? And have you ever wondered how much to intervene with a toddler or a preschooler, or how much to let them do all by themselves, as they like to demand? Parenting well with food may come naturally to some, but for most of us, it'll probably take some time and attention to the whole matter to figure out how to go about it. And it can be very different for each kid, especially the special needs kids in our families. So thankfully, Ellen and other childhood feeding researchers have given us a lot of great ideas to think about, some of which I'll be presenting to you in this short webinar. So the objectives of my part of the talk will be talking about what is picky eating, how do caregivers prevent picky eating, and how do caregivers support eaters that are already labeled as picky. So just to review where we're at with the spectrum of behavioral development, toddlers have hopefully learned by their age to trust their parents and caregivers, and now are beginning to assert themselves and realizing they're separate little beings from their parents. Toddlers tend to take this job very seriously, taking charge and saying no often to prove it. And when it comes to food, they're usually aware that it's something they have in their control, since their parents are now depending on them to actually put the food and drink in their mouths for the most part. However, they do need the reasonable and firm limits in order to feel secure in their relationships and environments. They can and will endanger themselves, other persons, and property if you let them. So when it comes to food, what do you think a toddler's favorite word is? Or that's right, of course, no. No wonder over half of toddlers are labeled as picky eaters at some point or another. It's hard to remember in the moment sometimes that that's really what they need to be doing and acting at this age and stage, and it's really a natural and protective behavior. While adults are mostly aware of what food is safe and what's not, it's something that we need to learn and adapt to. We don't want our kids putting everything in their mouths, whether it's poisonous berries in the forest, an instinct that perhaps is left over from our ancient ancestors, to the family cat's poop. So it's good to remember that kids are experiencing foods, textures, and situations often for the first time, and it's natural for them to be cautious. So this also tends to be a time when kids' growth naturally slows. The general rule of thumb is birth weight triples the first year of life, then only about 5 pounds a year average from ages 1 to 5 years old, with a minimum expected weight gain of about a pound every 6 months. So that's not much after they turn 1. Of course, the growth spurts are happening, and genes as well as nutrition determine this trajectory. So some parents are just surprised by their child's lack of appetite and spurts in food acceptance, that they get pretty nervous and frustrated after their toddler goes days on end with hardly eating anything, and how easily temper tantrum mode can be triggered by the parents' reminders or reassurances that they should just try a bite. This form of encouragement can sometimes backfire, however, and this is where the research can really help us understand what's going on. So why are some kids picky eaters in the first place? It's really fascinating. Once you dig into the literature on this topic, you find out that all of us are so unique, and there's a large spectrum in how we perceive and experience our food and eating, and it is somewhat genetically based. An interesting twin study was published earlier this year in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, looking at around 2,000 pairs of identical and fraternal twins and parents' descriptions of food pickiness over time. The researchers estimated that for food fussiness, or picky eating, 46% of cases may be down to genetic influence, and for food neophobia, the fear of new foods, 58% may be down to genetic influence. They also found that shared environmental influences did play a role, particularly for food fussiness. So the fact that the research found a strong genetic influence on both picky eating and refusal to try new foods should really reassure parents who have picky eaters who often feel judged or guilty that it's their fault their child is a fussy eater. And so, despite a strong genetic basis, of course, there is hope kids' behavior can be changed. The researchers themselves stressed in their conclusion that parent-led eating behavior change programs for picky or food neophobic young children is likely to be effective in decreasing the influence of gene expression. All that goes to say you can actually change the way your kids' genes are expressed by the way you parent with food. There's been recently a gene also found responsible for taste variation. It determines how strongly someone tastes bitter flavors. So scientists have also discovered the gene predicts the strength of sweet tooth cravings among children. Kids who are more sensitive to bitterness preferred sugary foods and drinks. There's also some really interesting research showing that some people are what is termed super tasters. These people represent about 25% of the population and experience flavor just more vividly and intensely than the rest of us. Another 25 to 30% are non-tasters, and the rest of us fall somewhere in between. Super tasters are less likely to eat veggies due to some bitter compounds contained in some of them. Super tasters also don't prefer super sweet, high-fat foods as much as non-tasters, who tend to prefer them a lot. Also, breast milk and amniotic fluid have been found to affect the taste preferences later in life. Studies have showed that what mom eats during pregnancy affects taste preferences soon after birth and after the baby has been weaned or starts eating baby food. Every baby has a different and unique experience before they even come to the table. So everyone that feeds kids just really needs to understand and honor that. And the complexity is just amazing. Plus, these influences are layered on the genetic predispositions. So this is really why we need to respect a toddler's space to make up their own minds when it comes to how they experience food. Caregivers need to establish limits and a healthy environment in which kids can really explore and learn more about food and their senses related to eating. So Ellen Satter has a wonderful set of guidelines that's very helpful to figuring out what's a parent's responsibility around feeding their kids and what's the child's responsibility. And if you take one thing away from my part of the webinar today, take this tidbit, the division of responsibility. So grown-ups provide the what, when, and where of feeding, and children do the how much and whether of eating. Both child care providers and parents can provide a variety of attractive, wholesome food in pleasant surroundings, and then work together to ensure a positive meal and snack time experience for the kid. After that, it's really up to the children to eat. So they all have their own interesting ways of going about it, as we've all observed. And on a day-to-day basis, it can really look like kids aren't accepting foods. But over the long haul, kids do eat, and they do learn to like a variety of food. So specifically, really what this means for parents is selecting and buying food, so doing the meal planning and the purchasing, making and presenting the meals, regulating the timing of meals and snacks so the child is hungry when they're ready to eat, presenting the food in the form the child can handle, so making the food safe, cutting into smaller bites, making mealtime pleasant, so having a pleasant environment and talking about pleasant things, helping the child participate in the family meal, so giving them unbreakable dishes might be a good idea, making sure the food can be chewed well, soft and moist, works best for kids at this age for the most part. Having the child, helping the child attend to their eating. So just giving them gentle reminders of what's going on if they get distracted. And then maintaining standards of behavior at the table. But the parent does need to just back off regarding how much the child eats, whether they eat, and how their body turns out as a result. So every child is a different shape and size, and that's unique to them. By the time a child gets into preschool, they're growing into themselves. They're very aware they're a unique person, and they're getting better at it. The same division of responsibility from the toddler period applies, only they're getting better with their choices, their limits, and like to be even more independent. So they're not as scared of new foods anymore. They can verbalize their likes and dislikes, fears and sensitivities about the food, instead of just acting them out like they would when they were a toddler. They get better at chewing, swallowing, and drinking from cups too, and they take pride in those abilities. They also really need and love the social time and the learning at the table with parents, daycare providers, siblings, and friends. And speaking of social learning, kids at this age really do pick up on pressures of all forms to eat. There's been some interesting research. Leanne Birch, a child development researcher in Illinois, did an experiment where she rewarded one group of preschoolers for trying new food. Another group of preschoolers was simply introduced to the food with no comments or encouragement of any kind. A few days later, they gave the two groups of kids the same foods, and the rewarded preschoolers were less likely to go back to the new food than the ones who had been allowed to approach the food in their own way. So from this research, it looks like kids recognize even the most positive enticement as pressure and are kind of put off by it. So prevention is really about making sure the normal behavioral course can take place at the table, just like in the rest of life, on the playground, at daycare, and school. So it's really about building the right environment for the child to positively experience food in their own unique way. So it's about having parents and childcare providers being aware children will challenge themselves to eat new food, and they don't necessarily need all the persuasion. It's about supporting kids with the what, when, and where of eating, so kids can get down to the business of learning to eat. Kids need to be in feeding situations where they feel in control of the how much and if of eating. Kids also need to be allowed to waste food. Eating is a multisensory experience, and it does take time to learn. And this doesn't give them the right to throw food, but they do need to experience touching it and putting it to their lips and just feeling around it for a while. And I want to acknowledge that this can really be a barrier for some families that have difficulty with budgeting around food. So it can still be done. I encourage the families that I work with on a budget to utilize frozen fruits and vegetables, so they can just pull out small amounts for their children, especially if it's a new food. And then keeping in mind serving sizes. So really the rule of thumb is just 1 tablespoon of each little food group that you put on the child's plate per year of age. So that's just a few tablespoons. And when it's a new food, you can even get by with a little bit less just to expose them to that food. So kids in the toddler and preschool years have not really learned important lessons adults have yet when it comes to eating, which is sometimes you have to deal with things not going your way, and foods presented is not your favorite or what you're used to. So adults will often eat anyway, but kids often won't. So just recognizing that everything is very new to them and experiencing things for the first time. Also, kids need to be in environments where they feel safe and secure to eat. So this is basically a list of a few things that can go wrong there that are the opposite of the previous slide. So the adult decides how much and whether the child should eat. Adults do what's called short order cooking, where they're basically asking the kid what they will eat and then cooking that for them, no matter what else the family's eating for the meal or the snack. Sometimes needs can go unnoticed. So it can be a lack of planning. Snacks aren't planned or forgotten, or they're just given on the fly, which sometimes ends up being junk food because that's what's there. Or there could be a social or emotional need going on with a child that can be a really big distraction. So that can be part of the equation too. Getting after the child about the amount or type of food can prove to be difficult for the feeding relationship. Obviously, forcing food can often backfire. And this really stems from a fear that I've seen for most parents, and that they just aren't aware that their kids are capable of choosing nutritious diets and trusting their child to get it eventually. So this is a lack of planning or distractions. Parents need support to improve parenting skills sometimes, or addressing core issues that are getting in the way of them planning routines for their family. And I think the biggie here too is just acknowledging that parents were once children too, and how their parents parented around food can really be huge as far as how they approach the feeding relationship too. So just digging deep and acknowledging where you're at is a really good behavior to get into. To keep it simple, once a child is labeled a picky eater, here are my top 5 strategies to really changing the feeding relationship and helping improve how a child experiences meals and snacks. So tip number 1, set a schedule for meals and snacks, no snacking in between. This will increase the motivation of eating the foods presented at the meal and snack, because the child will have time to build up their appetite. If the child is thirsty between meals, it's really important to just offer water, not juice or milk. Anything other than water could become too filling and ruin their appetite. And sometimes we forget that because it doesn't seem like a lot, but it can be a lot to a child. Tip number 2, minimize distractions like iPads, TVs, particular toys. Presenting meals and snacks in a location that's away from all that is best. And if the child isn't concentrating on the food and constantly running around or engaged in other activity, of course, they're going to be less likely to eat. Tip number 3 is something Kasey mentioned too, modeling foods that you want your child to eat. So if they see you eating it, they're going to be more willing to try it. And this works in the opposite way with junk food too. Tip number 4, you should be the one setting the limits. A lot of times I see parents asking the child if they want to eat or what they will eat. So this setup can really lead to a vicious cycle of trying to avoid tantrums over food. So I encourage you to avoid that. Of course, it's easier to keep the peace and avoid the tantrum, but what are you really doing for the child's relationship to food in the long run? So most days, try to set the limits. Tip number 5, tap into motivation. So especially for children who have feeding problems or are really picky eaters, oftentimes they just don't find food motivating at all or rewarding in and of itself. So if we can tap into something that they really enjoy doing or playing with, or reserving the object or activity until after they have sat at the table and made their attempt to eat, it can be powerful reinforcement. So this isn't about saying you have to eat 3 bites and then you get to do this, but just having the expectation there to sit at the table and make an attempt. And this, with this one, each kid is different, and it definitely shouldn't be overused, but it can be a powerful reinforcer for some. So different environmental approaches include, and this is a nice list, so setting a feeding schedule and routine, keeping the same time, place, and routine, for the most part, helps kids know what will happen during meal times and what you want them to do during meals. You can still do this on the fly if you can keep generally to the time of eating and eating with your child, and build that into feeding when out and about. Avoiding all day eating. So ideally, other family members shouldn't be snacking all day. If your family snacks all day, your child will too. Providing a comfortable and supportive seating. So make sure your child is able to sit upright without leaning, swaying, or dangling their feet. This really reduces distracting behaviors and allow them to feel grounded and safe during mealtime. Limiting meal time. So even picky eaters do most of their eating within the first 30 minutes. At the end of mealtime, remove the food and let them do what they want to do to go on and play with their other activities. Minimizing distractions. So we talked about this one before, TV, iPads, toys, all of that. Getting your child involved, allowing them to be able to explore and play with different food, whether it's at the table or in the kitchen with you, without the expectation necessarily that they have to put it in their mouths, but just getting that experience. Practice pleasant and healthy eating behaviors. So children learn by observing, and they will learn. You don't have to repeatedly prompt, coax, or beg your child to eat. Rewarding positive behaviors. So it's okay to offer praise. It's great to offer praise when your child approaches or tries new food or any way they interact with it that's new to them. It will increase the likelihood that they'll do it again. And ignoring negative behaviors when possible, ignoring your child when they're doing such annoying things as spitting, throwing, or refusing food. Remember, you don't want to be encouraging these behaviors by paying more attention to the negative stuff than the positive. Remembering the rule of 3. So this one is really helpful, just including 1 or 2 new foods your child, or 1 or 2 foods your child already likes, and then 1 food that your child does not yet like or feel comfortable around. And if your child won't tolerate the food on their plate, place it on a separate plate near them or a bowl near them to help them get used to the new food. And then making presenting meals in fun ways as well. So now I just have a few minutes to talk about some of the ways children with special needs differ. And just will quickly point out that while the division of responsibility still exists with these kids, they need more help, more support, and more adaptation to meet their needs around eating. So these kids have unique growth patterns. A lot of times it's a process of the disease itself or the condition that they have that changes their growth trajectory. It can be hormone and endocrine. Their metabolisms can change. Their gastrointestinal patterns are very different than other children often, and they can be more prone to infections, which also can affect their growth. So these kiddos also have altered textures and thickness needs. So for neurological issues, low muscle tone in the jaws and with swallowing issues. Some kids have aspiration risks, so you really do have to meet certain thickness requirements. A lot of kids with special needs can experience more pain and discomfort, and we don't always sense this right away, but just being aware of it, that some kids have food allergies and inflammation going on when it comes to trying some foods that are masked or hidden for a while. Some kids can easily be overstimulated, especially kids on the spectrum. Any GI issues like reflux, constipation, lactose intolerance, gagging on foods, all these things are more common in this population. But still within that scope, within that limited choice in diet, you can still expand slowly. And one way to really start doing that is just keeping a good rotation of the foods that they do already accept, so they're not getting used to the same foods meal after meal, day after day. So that can really help. And then just realizing and being aware of how long and how many steps it can take for these sensitive kids to eat can be really useful. So Dr. Kay Toomey developed a useful guide for parents and providers to understand and work with problem feeders called the Step to Eating Framework. Did you even know there were so many steps to eating? There's a lot here. So Dr. Toomey has developed a very successful transdisciplinary approach that is often used by dietitians and occupational therapists, and starts with addressing the reasons why a child is struggling to eat. It looks at feeding from a whole child perspective and integrates sensory, motor, oral motor, behavioral, learning, medical, and nutritional factors. So when do you really know when a child has crossed the line from being a picky eater to a problem feeder? Dr. Toomey gives us some really helpful guidelines, and I won't read through all this, but you can use this as a resource, and you can get a sense when your child might need some extra help. So these are kids and families, if you do have a problem feeder, that would really benefit from receiving more support from an occupational therapist, a speech language pathologist, or a dietitian. This is another great handout from Dr. Toomey's website that can give parents and providers guidance and insight into how serious their child's feeding problem is, or perhaps isn't. I'll let you review that one on your own. But parents can, go through this and take it to appointments and show providers if they do have concerns. And last but not least, food chaining is a pretty cool concept. It was developed by a dietitian named Sherry Frocker and is often used with problem feeders. So just real briefly, food chaining is a child-friendly treatment approach that builds on the child's successful eating experiences. The foods a child accepts and they're studied for patterns in taste, texture, and temperature. New foods similar to the ones the child already eats are used to create the food chains or links formed between the foods a child already accepts and the new targeted foods parents and the child's team wants them to eat. So the child is presented with the new foods they're likely to eat, and they're similar to ones that they already enjoy eating. So food chaining uses a variety of techniques to make food more palatable to kids that are afraid of eating. Food chaining progressively desensitizes kids to the tastes and textures of foods from all the food groups and works to improve their nutritional status by slowly over time incorporating a wider range, such as fruits and vegetables and meats, into their diets. So this is an example where a child starts out with chicken nuggets and food chains their way all the way over to breaded vegetables and baked chicken. So if you're interested in this approach, occupational therapists and dietitians that specialize in pediatric feeding problems are the professionals that are most familiar with food chaining.
Okay, this is Kasey again. So for providers, that wanted to offer you some information on how to refer a child to Children with Special Health Needs nutrition program when nutrition is a concern. Who is eligible? We serve children who are birth to age 21 who have a chronic physical or developmental condition, and they require services that are beyond the general services that are provided for children. It's a wide range of children that we see, and anyone who is in an early intervention program is automatically eligible for a referral. So anyone who has a developmental delay or is at risk of having a developmental delay. And it can be for many different reasons. We have a list of reasons on our referral. Something as simple as the family is interested in providing better nutrition to their child and has questions. So we left it open-ended that way. But of course, we see children with very complex medical conditions as well. So if you have any questions, you can kind of click through the links here or give us a call. And here is a map that we made of all of the dietitians assigned to the various counties. We cover all of Vermont, and currently, I am proud to say, we do not have a waiting list for a child to be seen. That's not always the case, but we work hard to see children as quickly as possible, as we know that young children, things can change quickly. So we get in there, do a lot of home visits with families, and try to make it as family-centered and as individually approached as we can. So we see children where they're at, what's going on. We look at the whole child, as complex as their sleeping habits or, definitely their bowel patterns and what can be affecting their eating habits.
And this is Kelli again. So this is my list of online resources. So they're all click-through links. Some of the handouts, if you want to work with your provider on some of the concerns that you have with your child, are there, as well as just more learning and some of the things that I mentioned. And then I think my resources and references, my references are listed here if you want to dig further into the literature. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. We have some questions here, Kelli.
All right.
I will let you look at these, and I'll go through maybe one of the first ones here. Here's a question. Any thoughts on using food, especially sweets, as a reward or incentive for your children? For instance, if you pick up your toys, you get a cookie. Now, I think this is like a kind of a personal question. And I would say, in my professional opinion, to avoid using food as a reward as much as possible, especially sweets. And it is tough to do. You find yourself just kind of repeating what your mom just said, or your grandmother, or other people might be, using sweets as a reward to your own child when they are caring for them. So it's a complicated world out there, and there are sweets everywhere. So I would just say dig in your heels as a parent and really try to be conscious about when you're using sweets as a reward. I think there's some room for saying you need to finish your vegetables on your plate before you have dessert. But it really depends on who that child is that you're speaking to. Are you talking to a 12-year-old typically developing, little girl who, she eats broccoli and she's just being a little stick in the mud and she wants to go get that cake? Then you can really kind of set your limits there. But are you talking to a really sensitive child who has a hyper gag reflex when you push food that they really cannot stand? Well, then maybe it's time to lighten up and let them have dessert with everyone if they ate a good meal already, an adequate meal, in your opinion. But things like potty training, that gets tricky. I've seen potty training happen really quickly with M&Ms, and I think I have a hard time saying never do that, to anything. I think anything in moderation is okay, but I would try to avoid it if you can.
Okay, we've got another good question here. Are the proportions of food groups, proteins, fruits and veggies, and grains the same for children as it is for adults? And are there U.S. guidelines on calorie intake for children by age? Yes and yes. So generally the proportions are the same. Choose My Plate and myplate.gov is a really good resource to go to check this out. But in general, about half of your plate full of fruits and veggies, a quarter grain, and a quarter protein, whether you're vegetarian or meat eating family or for that meal, is a good way to think about it. And a lot of parents really dig getting those little divided plates for their kids, because that's just a no-brainer. They don't have to think about it. And then a lot of times the children will remind the parents, where is this on my plate? So it's kind of a learning experience and getting feedback from both ends. So that's a great way to just generally look at it. And adult portions are very similar if you want to generally start moving your diet towards a healthier balance. And if you do want to personalize and really know the calorie needs, just a kind of place to start with, so you can start reading food labels and seeing what the balance is for your children's intake, I would encourage you to check out myplate.gov. And there are little calculators and tools on there that you can really use. Or if you're working with a dietitian, we can help you with that as well. Because some children, like I was saying earlier, just based on GI or neurological issues, will have different needs or growth trajectories. So that is personal to a certain degree, but there are some general calculators out there, and that's a good resource for sure.
Yeah, and we can add that link to our slideshow here, so when it's posted, it should be there. Here's another question. I'm trying to offer a variety of foods to my toddler, but mealtime has been a power struggle. Any suggestions? Another tough one. I think toddlers are good at having power struggles over lots of things, not just meal times. And so thinking of how you approach parenting a toddler in a general way sometimes can be helpful. if they're having a struggle with potty training or with sleeping, oh God, they just don't want to go to sleep. You do have to set your limits. Your child needs to brush their teeth every day, for instance, kind of whether they enjoy it or not. And I'm not talking about forcing children, but really kind of using strategies and those parenting techniques, very general parenting techniques, to know when to push your child and when to let up. So struggles around meal times, it can become a habit, and I don't wish it on anyone. I would say some specific strategies I've given to parents are to put on some music, take some deep breaths, and just relax. You want meal times to be relaxing, and safe, and not just enjoyable, but a time to kind of sit and digest your food. So even like thinking of making it more European and lighting some candles. I think I've suggested having a glass of wine to certain people who I know that would be an okay strategy for. And just relaxing and enjoying and really kind of being conscious of your own emotions, because children are so in touch with their caregivers' emotions. So if you're running hot, it's easy for your child to run hot. And really, as the parent and as the role model, you want to kind of model staying calm and making it less of a struggle, is on your end at least.
Those are some great suggestions, Kasey. So the next question is, I'm glad this one got brought up. I'm a vegetarian and want to feed my children a vegetarian diet. What suggestions do you have? So I totally encourage that if that's in your food culture and beliefs, to adopt a vegetarian diet for your children as well. For some children, it can be more difficult than others. So some children with special needs, it can be very difficult to get in all the nutrients they need on a vegetarian diet. But, it's very possible. If you're a vegan family, I would encourage you to at least supplement with B12. That's one that's very difficult to get in with a vegan diet. So giving your child a multivitamin in that case. But if you're more flexible and offer milk or fortified soy milk even, and little pieces of cheese, B12 isn't as much of an issue. That being said, definitely, if you're giving a variety of foods, you can get enough protein. Protein and iron are big ones for a vegetarian diet that a lot of pediatricians or parents are concerned about, and those can definitely be worked into a vegetarian diet. So I always encourage, there's a lot of vegetarian foods that are really good finger foods, or like beans of all different sorts, roasting beans, sauteing beans with different flavors and vegetables. Little pieces of tofu and baked tofu are great little finger foods for kids that they tend to love. There's lots of different mixes for like vegetarian meatballs and things like that are in fun shapes for kids. So you can really get a lot of iron and protein into kids that way, covering things with sauces. One thing to keep in mind is that all of the foods, if you are a vegetarian family, tend to have a lot of fiber. And while this is a wonderful thing to keep your family healthy and regular, this can be difficult and fill up a child pretty quickly. So when it comes to offering those types of foods more often, you really have to take a look at how much they need to grow. They do have, it's harder to get in the quantity when you're doing foods with a lot more fiber. And so really looking at coating those foods with sauces or healthy fats like olive oil, things like that, are a good idea. So you're really able to get in a little bit more calorie density into those foods with higher fiber. And would encourage you, just like any diet, it can be tempting even with vegetarian type foods to not use a lot of the processed type foods. So children are getting a good variety of foods and mixing up their colors. And just offering them a good variety will help them get in their nutrition on a vegetarian diet. So those would be the few top things I would start thinking about.
Okay, another question. My child eats healthy foods at home. However, preschool provides children with sweet and salty foods. What can a parent do? Great question. I think that really depends on your situation, but I would encourage parents to ask the teacher first and foremost, and then maybe go to the administration beyond that if you need to simply put out a little newsletter or a little request to the other parents, asking them, about what. So I guess if they're let me backtrack. I would ask the teacher if there's anything that you can do about what's being provided. It's very likely that there are other parents that feel the same way as you, at least one or two, if not more. And systems can be changed pretty quickly and easily sometimes, and sometimes it's more difficult. So, I have definitely made an effect on my children's school in the past by being a little bit of a squeaky wheel and just being friendly too, and saying, hey, what do you think about asking parents not to send in dessert for birthdays? I know, it's kind of it's not as fun. You can't if you really want to send in cupcakes for your child's birthday, but if there are 20 kids in your kid's class and there's 20 days with cupcakes, it's just a lot of sugar, and it's hard for some kids. It's more challenging than others. So I would just start with the basics and talk to your preschool teacher first, and see what can be done, and then take it from there. And we're lucky in Vermont. Some schools are amazing with the food that they provide, and I'm sure that most schools want to continue to make improvements in that area.
All right, and this looks like the last question. So, and this is great. How many meals and snacks do children eat throughout the day? Is a regular schedule preferred? And I'm sorry, this is something that I didn't address in my talk that I totally should have. So generally, what I'm recommending to parents with kids between the toddler and preschool age is 3 meals a day, with generally 2 to 3 snacks in between. So kids have pretty small bellies and need to frequently fill. So make sure to save time for those nutritious snacks in between their meals. Once you get into 4 to 5 snacks a day, you're really not giving your child a lot of time for them to empty their belly before the next meal or snack. So that can just lead to more fussiness and more negative interaction and feedback. So while it can be tempting to give in to that request for a snack for whatever, or I'm hungry before dinner, for the most part, just offer them some water and encourage them to either, if they can, if they're old enough to cook alongside you, mix a little something, set the table, keep them going until mealtime is ready. And really sticking to a regular routine is the preferred way to do it, yes. So having a child wake up and start with breakfast on their plate is really a good thing, just to get their day going and for them to feel safe and know that the meals and snacks are going to be provided to them, so they don't have to overeat for a snack or meal because they don't know when the next one is coming. Sometimes that can get in the way, and children can become anxious when they don't have that regular pattern. That being said, things come up, sports games happen, you're driving around or have events that take place, and that's fine. If most of the time that routine is there, then your child can be more flexible when those times happen that you can't get to feeding right away, or But that being said, too, you can always bring a few little snacks along, and I always recommend having like a little bag in the car with some cereal or pieces of fruit that don't go bad too easily, little crackers, things like that that you can do on the fly too, so you can keep it as regular as possible when you're out and about. So good question.
I want to thank everybody for joining us for our webinar today. This webinar is going to be saved along with all of our other webinars on our website. We'll also save a copy of the PowerPoint that you've seen today. You can also check out our website, which is vermontfamilynetwork.org, for a lot of different resources that we offer and all of our upcoming events. Of course, if you ever want to talk to someone here at Vermont Family Network, our services, we offer those at no cost to you. So please give us a call. Our 800 toll-free number is 1-800-800-4005. Have a good day, and thanks again.